Corsair's new 465X case sets itself apart from all the other glass and RGB cases by trying to actually allow the front panel to still breathe. We'll test that in today's thermal testing to see if it works out. It's got large air gaps on either side of the glass, and with a wall of air being pushed through the 3 front fans, the 465X may actually be able to break some of the unfortunate themes of poorly cooled glass-paneled cases. Today we're reviewing Corsair's 465X for thermals, acoustics, noise-normalized thermals, and build quality. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and its Straight Power 11 series power supplies. The Straight Power 11 PSUs ship from 450 watts up to 1000 watts, accommodating most of the gaming PC build requirements you'd encounter, and focuses on delivering a higher quality power supply that doesn't sacrifice on efficiency or stability. Noise is also a heavy point for the Straight Power 11, using a 135mm Silent Wings 3 fan that can spin as low as 200 RPM for quieter, low-load operation. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the 465X, it's got a few changes, but for the most part, it's based on the 460X. If you're familiar with that one, you already know most of the basics of this. The case is $160 in this format, obviously with the panels on it, though, those are included. And it competes with something like the Cooler Master H500P Mesh, that's about a $160 case. The NZXT H700 or H710 without the smart device would be in a similar price category. Pretty competitive at its price point as well. The Lian Li 11 Dynamic is very popular. It's $140, but you would have to buy fans with it, so that puts you up around the same price. So that's the competition. The 465X doesn't particularly feel like a $160 case. It's not that fancy. It's a bit of a smaller mid-tower ATX box. The thermals are mostly acceptable, as you'll see in our testing. But the big thing here is that Corsair's trying to say, look, we're not giving up on glass. We're not giving up on this tempered glass and RGB trend, but let's try and fix it. So you've got more clearance here on the front panel, where even though everything's super blocked off on the dead center front, there's enough air on the sides here that you've got some free flow through the front panel, where we'll test and see how it does in thermals today. But it's certainly better than just doing a flat glass panel on the front like most manufacturers do. A couple of really small things in this case that we wanted to point out before getting into the bigger details. You'll see some black accents here, like in the PCIe slot covers, in this vertical slot cover. The SSD trays, those are black as well, although you never see those. They're internal, covered by the panel. And for these things, we suspect that this is an instance of Corsair not wanting to repaint everything on the case. Because if they do this, Corsair is able to use the same supply for their PCIe slot covers. The same comes from the same pool of all the ones used for their other cases, including the 460X, the black version, or the 465X black version, potentially. And you can reuse this bit too without needing to repaint it. So it's a bit of a cost-saving thing. It ends up looking like it's intentional because you get some black accents on the white case, but it was probably potentially a let's find a way to use all of our materials thing first, and then it became an accent, which is okay. It's okay if you can work in a cost-saving measure into being a feature, of course, but whether you like it or not is up to you. It's just such a small thing. It's at the back of the case, so it doesn't particularly matter. Let's get into the stuff that does matter, though. We're going to talk about the build section, talk about the ease of installation process, build features, things like that, and then we'll go through thermals and talk conclusions at the end of if it's actually worth it versus the competition. The 465X isn't any bigger than it needs to be, so there's only about 2 centimeters of clearance above the motherboard and none at all between the bottom edge and the power supply shroud. Fortunately, the motherboard tray doesn't extend all the way to the top of the case, so the cutouts for CPU power cables have some extra room to work with and can fit cables fairly comfortably. Cable management behind the motherboard tray isn't great, ranging from about 1.5 centimeters at the rear of the case to about 2 centimeters at the front of the case, where there's a shallow depression bordered by cable tie points. We aren't impressed with this, since the cable cutouts and the tie points are on one edge of that shallow depression, meaning that most of the extra space will likely be left empty unless solid-state drives are installed in it. The number of tie points is, however, appreciated. There are 2 standard removable 2.5-inch sleds behind the motherboard tray, and 2 further mounting points in the cable management space at the front of the case, as mentioned earlier. The removable sleds don't fit on these mounting points. They're just places to screw the SSDs directly into the tray. Since Corsair already ships 2 sleds with the case, we'd rather see 2 more optional mounting points for them. On the subject of minor changes, it'd also be nice to have reusable expansion slot covers on the vertical PCIe slots as well as the horizontal ones, rather than the disposable pop-out variety that you would find on the Walmart PC. Literally, that's what they use. The hard drive tray is nothing short of unusual. It's just a metal box that holds 2 plastic sleds, and it is removable. Depending on the user, that may make up for somewhat limited cable management space. If no hard drives are installed, the whole power supply shroud becomes a place to stuff the extra cables. Our Corsair RM650X power supply is about 14 centimeters long, so we had 7 centimeters of space to work with. And that was between the end of the power supply and the start of the hard drive cage. As 5 1/4 bays are more or less dead at this point, mid-towers have become shorter front to back, meaning that there's less space under the power supply shroud to cram in both a power supply and hard drives. The power supply shroud is riveted in place and extends the full length of the case without a removable forward section like the older 460X. 3 LL120 RGB 1500 RPM fans are included with the case. We logged these closer to 1700 RPM, but there's always some variance fan to fan, and they're connected to an iCUE lighting node core. According to the spec sheet, this can connect 6 RGB fans only, no lighting strips. A 3-pack of Corsair LL120 fans would cost you $90 on Amazon at the time of writing. They're allegedly on sale, but they also come with a Lighting Node Pro, which can connect 12 fans, or strips, instead of only 6 fans. The node is controlled exclusively via USB with no external mechanical control, which means we didn't use it at all, because it'll be a cold day in hell before we install proprietary bloatware on our pristine case testing bench. But in the real world, you might be able to look past things like needing to control your environment and give it a shot. Corsair does get some points for having separate plugs for fan control, 3-pin, and RGB control, but users should be aware that the lighting node core connects only to the RGB plugs, and the fans must therefore be powered from the motherboard or some other source. Front I/O is 2 USB 3.0 ports and a combined mic and headphone jack. Corsair could maybe afford to put a USB 2.0 port on the front panel as well, since the lighting node already assumes a motherboard with 2.0 headers, but we rarely see mid-towers with more than 2 USB Type-A ports. The front and side panels of the 465X both attach with thumb screws. The glass of the front panel is stuck to the plastic frame with adhesive, so picking a mounting mechanism that goes over this and sandwiches everything securely onto the chassis was a good choice. The edges of the glass front panel are beveled inwards to fit the angle of the plastic frame, which is a nice and minor touch that a lot of companies would overlook. We'll discuss thermal performance later in the review, but Corsair is clearly at least trying to let air in, with 2.2 centimeters of clearance between the chassis and the glass and minimal obstructions beyond the dust filter. It does seem strange to go through all of this effort to make a glass front panel work when it's entirely decorative, since the filter is in the front of the fans rather than on the side vents. Removing the front panel leaves all the front I/O, the filters, and the fans in place and functional. It's very nearly a fine mesh case like we've been looking at lately, except with glass spaced in front of that. It's important to keep some perspective though, and remember that the front panel is included in the price of the case and does nothing but look shiny and block a little bit of air. But we'll look at how much that is, because it is spaced quite far, and that's going to go a long way to improving the airflow. Whether the panel's worth it or not, of course, is up to the buyer. The 465X uses the same 3-intake and no exhaust stock layout as the Phanteks P400A that we recently reviewed, and it does this to maximize the visibility of the RGB LEDs. We kept our testing limited to the standard batch of benchmarks plus 1 torture test. The bottommost fan moved to the rear exhaust slot, and the other 2 fans shifted down about 1 centimeter to see if more normal layout would work better. It's important to test various layouts, but we don't really advocate swapping the fans around or replacing them with this particular case, because of the fans being the way they are. There are 3 distinct cutouts for 120mm fans at the front of the case, and installing larger fans or moving the stock fans around breaks up the RGB pattern and defeats the purpose of choosing the 465X over some other cheaper, similarly or better performing case. Half the point of this one, as with most Corsair products, is LEDs. We'll start the thermal charts with just 3 Corsair 465X tests and then move on to the comparative data versus other cases. CPU temperature during torture testing averaged 51.5 degrees Celsius over ambient. Taking the front panel off only lowered this about 4 degrees to 47.6 degrees delta T over ambient, so the front panel evidently is not that restrictive. Remember though that this is a 4-degree improvement from removing a decorative element, since we left the filter in place when we removed the panel. Removing the filter would of course further improve performance, But in this instance, as there's no fine mesh to catch all the dust, most people should probably leave the filter on. A 4-degree reduction isn't a big deal, and overall, Corsair's large spacing between the front of the chassis and the glass panel is a good combination that allows it to perform as well as these particular fans will allow. Corsair proves that, as we've said for a few reviews now, you can have your glass and need it too. Corsair is getting the glass front panel like every case manufacturer seems to obsess over, but also spaces it so that the front is relatively breathable. So Corsair, thank you for proving our point. We appreciate it. Some of the other case manufacturers haven't listened to our thoughts on this, and we're happy to see that someone can prove that, yes, if you put glass on the front, but you put a big gap between it and the front, it can still breathe pretty well. Moving the bottommost intake fan to the exhaust slot behind the CPU cooler resulted in a CPU temperature of 52.1 degrees with an error of baseline for the test, but certainly not improved. It's like the Fantex P400A, where pushing a wall of air from the front of the case seems at least as effective at CPU cooling as the normal 2-intake, 1-exhaust setup, especially since we're using a tower cooler that has its own fan to direct air toward the exhaust. Moving on to comparative data, 51.5 degrees CPU temperature over ambient doesn't put the 465X among the modern mesh-fronted cases, but it's on par with the Evolve X or the Half X for CPU cooling. The Half X, to be fair, is much more known for its GPU cooling. The fact that Corsair includes 3 fans undoubtedly helps them in the stock testing, resulting in a middle-of-pack performance on this truncated chart of over 200 results. You can look at our older case reviews and directly compare data to this if you would like to do that. The Cooler Master H500 blank performed at 49.9 degrees over ambient and was one of our better results for $100 cases. So for Corsair to be between that and the stock Mesh of IC is a reasonably good place to be. Adding fans to the Mesh of IC obviously will boost its performance, but that's exiting stock configuration. Also, to be fair, it's a lot cheaper than this case is. The 465X is quite a bit more expensive. Back to just the 465X for a moment. GPU average temperature during the torture test was 51.4 degrees Celsius over ambient, almost the exact same as the CPU temperature. Improvement from removing the front panel was also similar, only lowering temperature to 47.8 degrees over ambient. Moving the bottom intake to the rear exhaust slot made thermals worse, averaging 54.1 degrees DT, which was expected here. The bottommost fan benefits the GPU if it benefits anything at all, and moving it to the top half of the case leaves only approximately half of one intake fan below the level of the GPU backplate. The closest GPU result that we've included on our comparative chart for the 465X would be the Corsair 570X, another glass-fronted case, but with a lower RPM fans. Having 3 intake fans is about the best thing you could do for GPU cooling in this case, but obviously temperatures would be even better without the front panel, and possibly a little better still without a full-length GPU shroud partially obstructing the bottom intake fan. Blender is next. CPU temperature during the Blender CPU render averaged 36.6 degrees over ambient, one of the better results that we've measured for that test, and again, very close to the Half X's result for CPU cooling. It also isn't distant from the Raven 02, another top performer on the charts. The reason the 465X has picked up here, relative to the previous charts and its positioning, is that there's no GPU load and only a heavy CPU load, so the CPU isn't dealing with heat spewing out of the video card below it. GPU temperature when GPU accelerating the render averaged 24.5 degrees Celsius, outperformed by several cases in terms of chart position in Blender for GPU, but not too distant in temperature from the best case we've tested in terms of actual numbers. 24.5 degrees over ambient roughly ties it with the RL06 and the RV02 in this test, both of which have above average GPU cooling capabilities. The Firestrike GPU temperature result was almost the exact same as with the baseline torture test, averaging 51.9 degrees over ambient. It remains on the cool side of the chart, but real heavy hitters in the GPU cooling department like the SL600M and the Half X outperform it. There's only so much GPU cooling that can be accomplished with a standard front-to-back airflow pattern and a power supply shroud. The 465X scores respectively close to the H500M mesh and the Silverstone PM01. Using our standardized set of Noctua fans, 2 140 intake, 1 120 exhaust, and you can watch a really detailed video on the ups and downs of this testing approach. For more information on this, it was requested by our viewers though. This, using that standard set, improves CPU temperature over baseline, lowering the temperature to 49 degrees Celsius over ambient. That's pretty good compared to the limited set of other cases we've tested, close to the Versa J24, and only really beaten by the 2 mesh-fronted cases that are the P400A and the Mesh of IC. The 465X is legitimately open to airflow despite its glass front, and again proves to other manufacturers that glass doesn't have to mean no ventilation. Sure, taking the glass panel off does improve temperature a bit, but an improvement of 4 degrees is completely within reason. Any case is going to increase CPU temperature a bit. Even removing the P400A panel improves temperature a little bit, so this is not unreasonable, really. GPU temperatures in our standardized fan chart averaged 54.5 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, definitely worse than baseline due to the lack of a fan at the bottom of the case, as you can see in this different chart from the previous one. We installed our two 140mm fans above the power supply shroud, but Corsair does provide 140mm mounting rails along the entire height of the front panel, so even though only two 140 fans fit, they can still be freely positioned. It's a nice feature, but it's unlikely anyone would ever choose to install 140 fans since they don't line up at all with the round 120 cutouts. 54.5 degrees over ambient is average among the cases we've tested so far with this particular approach, and it's almost exactly the same as the score of the Meshify C, to Corsair's credit. Noise results next, and then noise normalized results after that. 3 small fans spinning at 1500 RPM or 1700 with the 10% manufacturing variance. It gets loud. We measured the noise level at 44.4 dBA, and lowering that to 36 dBA threshold for our noise normalized testing required cutting the fan speed of the case fans to 55% in BIOS, or about 1000 to 1020 RPM according to software logging. That resulted in a CPU temperature of 59.6 degrees over ambient in our noise normalized chart. This is close to the ROG Strix Helios and on the warm end of the chart for noise normalized testing. The 465X isn't a quiet case, and making it into a quiet case by adjusting the fan speed makes it a warm case instead. GPU temperature was 54.8 degrees average, better relatively speaking than the noise normalized CPU temperature, and not that much higher than the baseline torture temperature of 51.4 degrees, but still closest in performance to the Helios, a fellow glass-fronted case. If Corsair started this process, the 465X, with designing a traditional mid-tower case, but wanting to have tempered glass on it, and also reuse some of the tooling from previously to keep costs down, then the 465X, as it stands here, is probably about the best result you could have asked for, because this is the best way to make a glass panel work on an existing chassis without totally suffocating it, or without basically going for a mesh panel instead, which obviously, for whatever reason, that's not, the case manufacturers seem to struggle with actually wanting to do mesh panels. The ones who've done it have been really successful so far, so we're happy to see that. That said, not every single case needs to be the same. Not every single case needs to have mesh panels. We recognize that. And so trying to make glass work, there's a couple that have done it well. The best example is the Lian Li 011 series, so the 011 Dynamic, the 011 XL. And the reason that works well is because it's compartmentalized in a way that the front, although glass and although completely flush with the chassis, is irrelevant because the side is where the intake happens for that case, or the bottom. And so that's an instance where you can make glass fronts work. We've been through this 1,000 times though. This is another way to do it, where you do glass on the front. You don't have to do any special changes. You don't have to compartmentalize it. You don't have to do new tooling even. And so you do glass on the front, space it out a lot, and put the fans behind it. It's still not the best, but the reduction in temperature from removing the panel entirely is minuscule for the most part. It's 4 degrees, which, yes, 4 degrees for effectively purely a visual embellishment is still a loss that you don't want to have if you're in the performance side of how you build your computers. But 4 degrees in the face of something like the Phanteks P400 non-A, the original, or like the BitPhoenix Enso, or like the Cooler Master H500P original case, not the mesh one. 4 degrees in comparison to those is quite good. So Corsair's done a thing where you get your glass and you get to eat it too, as we've said in multiple parts of multiple videos lately. They figured out how to do something as simple as spacing it away from the front panel. Some other cases have done this. For some reason, manufacturers are extremely resistant to doing this type of stuff. So Corsair's had a run of sort of poorly to averagely reviewed cases with us lately. They haven't done much that's been really stellar or impressive. A lot of them have been more negative or critical reviews. This one isn't as negative. The case is mostly fine. If you want some glass embellishment and you don't like how mesh looks, whatever, this is a way to achieve that compromise. The downside is that at $160, it does not really feel like an appropriate price for this type of case, because it feels like a pretty cheap mid-tower when you pick it up. At the end of the day, all the glass is off, all that. It's really not special. It's not any different from anyone else's cases. It doesn't have any special features. It does stuff that's been done since the S340 several years ago, like 5 or 6 even. So there's nothing particularly impressive with the chassis itself, which is fine, but we typically prefer to see that on something more like an $80 case or a $90 case. So at $160, the question of what is it you're paying for is answered with basically RGB LEDs. It's going to be the controller, the RGB LEDs, and to some extent this glass panel, but that's not really worth that much of the price delta you'd see versus other similarly constructed chassis. The frame itself is really basic, but it's fine. There's limited cable management space on this side, stuff like that. Pointed out some of the other things. We don't have any massive issues with the chassis. It's that disconnect between the price and what you're getting, and it doesn't particularly feel worth it. That said, it's not a bad case, and we're fine with saying go ahead and buy it if you like what you see, and this does everything you want. You want RGB, you want the control, the node, and you want this glass front that can still breathe a little bit. Definitely, we're fine with saying, you know, it's not something you need to avoid like some of the others we've reviewed. It's just that it feels a bit pricey for what it is, and that's a really common complaint in reviews, but in this instance, the chassis itself genuinely doesn't feel like it quite justifies it. So other cases in the price category, something like the H700, which we've reviewed. The H710 is a refresh of it. Without the smart device, you get a better deal there. Cooler Master H500P mesh is about $140 after rebate right now. The O11 Dynamic is, we would say, better build quality than this, but it's wider, so that's a bit of a concern for some people. And it is a more unique setup, and you do have to buy fans, so factor that in as well. Anyway, that's it for the 465X. It is simply fine. It's able to do a glass front panel without being complete garbage, and that's pretty rare. So Corsair, job well done on that for resisting everything everyone has been asking for in mesh, and still being able to piece together something with glass that does reasonably in thermals. It's not the best, but it's reasonable, and for a glass panel, it's definitely better than the industry average. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.